Hi, this is Kit, and this is part 2 of my Gamora jacket build. If you didn't see it, you should go back and watch part 1 before this video. This segment picks up the project right after the sleeves are sewn together into the red and brown pieces. Because this is pleather, the seams do not lie flat, and they need to be held down. If you're really neat, you can sew those seams down, but I'm not the neatest of sewers when it comes to like aligning into another straight line, and so I'm using hot glue to glue those seams down. I showed at the beginning of the video the difference between the sleeve that has the seams glued and the one that doesn't. It's a pretty big difference. You can kind of see it laying flat there. The glue is of course hot, so you'll want to take as much care as you can to not get burned. I use the end of chopsticks to help taper down the seams before pressing down with my fingers in order to avoid some of the heat. But you do have to press down because the pleather material highly resists being folded over like this. I even did a little bit of pre-ironing to soften the fabric to make it a little bit easier to do this, and it was still pretty difficult to do. So you can see that I'm finishing up that last seam and getting it nice and flattened here, using the chopsticks to press, adding more glue to help really secure that seam down. So at this point, yep, you can see how much nicer that sleeve looks with those seams. So at this point in the video, I wanted to try and create that bunched up look that Gamora's sleeve has, the rolled up look, and so I thought I could give it some creasing with some clips if it held it for a while, and I can tell you that it did not work. So you don't need to do this step, and when you see the sleeves are bunched up with pins and clips in the other segments of the video, you don't need to do that. So once the sleeves are held down, those seams rather, you'll attach the sleeves to the body sections. You're going to sew them along that seam allowance that you left, that 1/4 inch seam allowance at the sleeve seam. So this shows you the assembled jacket laid flat. I already flattened the seams, and actually this time I sewed them down because it was black on black. It was harder to see, and I think that the sleeves have the emphasis in this build anyway, but you might be able to see closely that I don't have the neatest of seams. All right, at this point you can start to see how the shrug is going to look. I want to point out here, this shrug pattern does not include a collar. So what I needed to do was go in and create a collar section. I used the collar from a coat that I own to get an idea of what it would look like. So you can see that I am laying that in there. And I then went online in search of a collar pattern. Now at this point, you're going to need to bear with me while I try to show what I ended up doing. I went online and found a very basic pattern for a shirt collar. I used the base of the actual measurement of the collar for my garment, so I took it from side to side for that base, and then I created the angle pieces. I created the pattern on butcher paper, pinned it down to my shrug to see how it laid. It laid pretty well, but it doesn't really reflect what Gamora's collar looks like. So I had to do my own custom attachment to make it swoop down like the end of Gamora's collar, which you can see here. I taped those two pieces together, and then I created a template from that with a seam allowance on the base where it was going to be hemmed into the shrug. You'll also see that there's an angle there. I could have smoothed that angle where it transitions from that straight collar to my custom little design, swoopy design there. I added, or I left it alone, and I'm glad I did. It kind of gave an interesting point to the color, but you could smooth it if you wanted to. I'm sorry that this is not as helpful in this tutorial as it could be, but it wasn't terribly hard to make. Now this is a long segment where I trace, cut out, and place the collar on the shrug. The whole part of the project here is pretty time intensive. I sped up the speed quite a lot because you are dealing with attaching a curve to another curve. So I did use the radial cutter to very carefully cut along the curve to get it off. I then proceed to pin up along those curves. So rather than joining the front of the fabric of the collar to the front of the shrug and dealing with a really stiff seam, I decided to join the backs together. The result was a seam that would lay flat and would help hide the inside of the shrug fabric at the collar point. If you were making a real coat, you'd be working with a lining, but since this is a costume, I wanted to really keep it simple. See my daughter waiting in the wings as I assemble the rest of this pattern very, very carefully. I also traced in kind of the point in the seam allowance that I wanted it to be at. The other thing that I wind up doing with this that I don't think is on video, after I've sewn the collar onto the body of the garment, I also sew down the seam along the edge of the collar. I think I sew it as narrowly as I can possibly get. So it might be like 1/8 of an inch or so to fold it over. And that's again to hide the reverse side of the collar fabric as it's pulled out. So you can see that sewn, you can see the edge that is hemmed. And at this point in the project, it's about stitching up the sides and stitching up the sleeve to actually finish the shrug. So now that the shrug was finished, I had my first fitting with my daughter. It fit, but it was really tight. It looks tiny at the moment, but I haven't added that long black section yet. You're going to see why I recommended working a size or two bigger in the shrug because of this. So stay tuned for the final part in my Gamora jacket build, which will include the long black flap at the back of the jacket. And I'm also going to include my lessons learned for this project.